Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Llano wash processed Guatemala from Llano Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Llano, based out of Langley, British Columbia. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on multiple occasions, including most recently when we reviewed their Thunguri AA, a wash processed Kenyan coffee. And in that review, I'd mentioned that we had reached out to the owners of Llano, asking them for some recommendations. So this is actually the second coffee that they had suggested to us, and it'll be interesting to see how it turned out, as this right here is day 41. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Llano's recipe, which is a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. I actually like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. As we alluded to in our previous Llano review, they do roast on the lighter side of things relative to a lot of Canadian coffee roasters. That being said, of the three coffees from Llano that we're going to be discussing, this one definitely felt like the most developed. Even then, a lot of people would consider this to be on the lighter side of things relative to those Canadian coffee roasters. So I think the best way to define this one is either on the more developed side of a lighter profiled coffee or on the lighter side of a medium light in terms of that roast profile. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and the cup was notably more vibrant and flavorful than initially expected, with a strong focus on the listed golden kiwi aspects of this coffee, with a sweeter tropical fruit aspect in the cup. It was rounded out a nice bit by a long-lasting herbal aspect and a slightly minty quality to it, so there's plenty of depth of flavor and a pretty positive first impression. Let me say this when it comes to kiwi, I oftentimes don't necessarily taste a very well-defined kiwi when it comes to kiwi notes in coffee. For me, it's often that slightly papery tropical fruit quality, which I know is a weird descriptor, but that's kind of the best way I've associated kiwi within coffee. So this right here had maybe the most definition to it, but for me it was honestly a little bit more of a tropical berry fruit with a strong brightness to it. But that in itself lent it to being a little bit more in line with that kiwi-like component to it. So I can kind of see it a little bit more with this coffee. Could also be the priming effect, but nonetheless, definitely something that was noted from that first try. Day 18 opted for the Chemex, and this one came out a slight bit more generic as it skewed a lot more in the classic Guatemalan sense with a chocolate base and a complementary tropical fruit brightness as well. Still pretty herbal, with that being one of the more pronounced characteristics, especially within the finish, so not necessarily quite as good on this second impression. Day 21, we opted for the April Brewer, and the cup was skewing a lot more in those traditional Guatemalan profiles, with a chocolate base being the most pronounced and defined characteristic right at the forefront, with a slightly nutty and herbal aspect also being pretty well pronounced. A fair bit of the fruit brightness is present yet again, and definitely not as good as that first impression. So we persist, continue on to day 24, as we opted for the V60 with Llano's recipe, and I was continuing to struggle to replicate that first experience, as this was a little bit more of a focus on the robust and traditional Central American characteristics with a stronger emphasis on the nuttiness as well as the chocolate right off brew. But it does settle a little bit better with a bit more of a caramelized sweetness to it and a little bit more structure in general, though a lot of those fruit aspects were maybe a little bit more dialed back, at least relative to that first impression. Day 27 through the Chemex with Llano's recipe, and it was notably improved on this day as there was a fair bit more brightness and sweetness, which was really important given that that most recent cup we had was skewing a lot more on those robust characteristics. It's offering a fair bit more of those Central American characteristics once again, but in a sweeter sense, with a slight bit more of the tropical brightness back yet again, and that complemented so many of the sugary components within it. The herbality is also still notable, as well as a complementary candied sweetness, so some depth in general, some more positive things to pick out, but this coffee is a little bit all over the board. I couldn't necessarily decide whether it wanted to be a brighter fruit profiled coffee or a little bit more of that classic Guatemalan coffee. Day 30 back through the V60 with Luna's recipe, and the cup in general has improved as there's plenty of sweetness and vibrancy. Once again, in line with the listed kiwi, though it's still not necessarily to the extent of our first impression of this one. Plenty of the Central American characteristics with a sweet chocolate and caramelized aspect to it. So a nice cup in general, though still not necessarily as good as that first impression with the V60. Tried it again one more time, and I was experiencing some inconsistency as it resorted back to the earlier struggles, with this one being the most earthy and herbal we had experienced of this coffee. There's still an abundance of tropical fruit brightness relative to what you would experience from Guatemalan coffees, but even then that was secondary to a lot of the more robust characteristics of that coffee. Day 36. Final note we have through the Chemex with Luna's recipe, and the cup continues to feel very nice. It feels like it's improved with time as the strong fruit brightness comes back a little bit more through this brew method, as it's much more in line with the experience from the start. Sweeter, caramelized, nutty aspects yet again, so a nice day, and I think this is kind of what I wanted to say on this coffee. The main reason I settled for the Chemex was because the later days skewed a lot more on the Chemex. The best experience I'd actually had of this coffee was the first time I brewed it, which was at day 15 mark, which offered a lot more of a fruit-forward profile than the later days we'd had of it. So make of it what you will. If maybe we had made some adjustments going back with that brew method, we might have been able to replicate those. But that being said, Chemex just seems to have a little bit more consistent of results after that mark. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so we'll go ahead and start with the cleanliness level 4. I don't necessarily think that will come as too much of a surprise. We do have a wash-processed Guatemalan coffee over here, and even though there was an ever so slight smoky quality to it, I don't necessarily think that that was ever going to take away from the definition within this one, which did skew a little bit more on those classic Central American characteristics as opposed to a hopeful, more bright, fruit-forward cup. So level 4, definitely an ideal fit for me in that sense. Finish, level 4. As I mentioned with the Kenyan coffee, I was liking the finish of that one a little bit more, because this one right here, it skewed a lot more in those classic Guatemalan characteristics, most specifically the herbality, which was something that was ever present within this coffee and not necessarily my favorite part of it. There wasn't as much of the long-lasting fruit brightness as I might have been hoping for, so level 4 seems to fit pretty well for that. Acidity level 4, keep in mind I'm making these tasting wheels side by side, so it's kind of interesting that there was still enough brightness within this coffee to keep it on equal measure to that Kenyan coffee. Obviously, I do have to say that I feel like there was a little bit more brightness in that Kenyan coffee, though this one still had enough of it to justify scoring all the way there at that level 4 mark, which once again I think is a little bit of an attribute of the roast profile as opposed to anything else. Though it could also be this coffee, as I don't have too much familiarity with this variety if I'm being completely honest. Berry fruit, level 4. I know that's probably a little generous, but I think it's kind of rounded out by the rest of the tasting wheel. Even though it didn't necessarily replicate a lot of those experiences going forward, I think I still had to say that at times it was a little bit more pronounced and a little bit more defined than a lot of the other classic Guatemalan characteristics, especially since this tasting wheel was made with the Chemex, as that's the best experience I'd had of this coffee. So berry fruit, perhaps a little generous, a little bit more in that tropical fruit sense, but given that it was just a little bit more pronounced than these other things, I think it's justified there at that level 4 mark, just specifically for that reason. Then we have a lot of level 3s. We'll start with the sweetness, level 3. I think, once again, making this coffee side by side with the Kenyan coffee, I said that the sweetness isn't necessarily as high as that Kenyan coffee, and that's why I want to keep it toned down. Though that Kenyan coffee did seem to have a little bit more sweetness and a slightly more of a candied sense, whereas this one right here was a little bit more of the kind of like chocolate caramelized sense, but not to the same sort of candied profile as that one, which is why I kept that sweetness a little bit lower. Florality, level 3, something I haven't even mentioned once, though I could not help but feel a little bit of an undefined floral aspect present within it, a little bit more of a generic florality though, and pronounced enough to actually score that level 3 mark, right there with a spice, as I think that kind of herbal component within this one, and even as I'd mentioned at the start, that slight minty quality to it does insinuate a little bit more of this spice characteristic that's present. And while we're on that topic, I'll just say you can also see it in the savoriness, which scored at that level 3 mark. Those are some really important characteristics that did give this cup a little bit more depth than just being straightforward. I think that they have a couple of things. Well, they do have a herbal note list on here, so that would make a lot of sense. And then what's the other thing? Burdock. I honestly don't know what that is, but nonetheless, I think that that's probably what I'm tasting in this coffee. Citrus fruit, level 3, and stone fruit, level 3. I feel like both of those are a little bit more of a kind of generic aspect within this one, though at times I could say that there was a little bit more of a sugary stone fruit, a little bit more of a just kind of classic citrus fruit in it. So those two things weren't necessarily absent in this coffee when I was making this tasting. I said, I'm getting traces of these, while they may not necessarily be the most pronounced or defined, they're at least present enough to score that high. Chocolate, level 3. And as I mentioned, on the second day from that point going forward, it was one of the more consistent characteristics of this coffee. Though I wouldn't necessarily say it was too heavy, though keeping it at that level 3 I think was just to kind of point at the berry fruit being ever so slightly more pronounced than it. Caramel, level 3, yeah, there was a pretty notable caramelized aspect to it. Looking at the saltiness, which is at a level 2, and I might change that also up to a level 3 because there was a very strong nutty attribute within this one. Already mentioned to savoriness, so I honestly think the last thing worth discussing is the body at a level 2, because that is probably a characteristic of the brew method we went with for this one, which was the Chemex, so that probably took a little bit of the body away. I was experiencing an ever a bit slight more body through the V60, but once again, making this tasting well side by side with the Kenyan coffee, I think that it probably just did not have as much of a body because I was comparing those two side by side as when I was making those tasting wells. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It was mixed because that first impression I had definitely lent it towards being one of the more enjoyable Guatemalan coffees I had had in quite a bit, as there were so many positives I took away. But once that happens, it can set it up for some struggles from that point going forward, because you want to replicate that first experience. And that's happened with a number of coffees we've reviewed over the years. Is you have that first impression, it's impressive, and you want to keep getting that cup over and over. But for some reason, all of the adjustments and tinkering you're making to maybe get a better cup of coffee could actually end up costing you, because I could never get that same cup of coffee back. And Chemex experiences I'd had on the later days were a little closer and a little better, but even then they didn't necessarily replicate that very interesting, strong, flavorful aspect I'd experienced of this coffee. So that's always an opportunity to put this one on me. I feel like maybe some of the adjustments didn't necessarily do this coffee justice, and there's a really nice cup hidden underneath all of the struggles that I did have from this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you're a little better at being able to replicate some really positive experiences, then possibly that tropical fruit brightness is the first place I want to start, because that was really impressive that first day that I had had it. But other than that, I think it really did seem to skew a lot more on the traditional Guatemalan characteristics. So lighter profiled Guatemalan coffee, because that's the first place to start with this one. Classic characteristics, chocolatiness, caramelized sweetness, as well as some of those herbal aspects. Great depth in that sense. If those are the types of coffees that really make you kind of enjoy these profiled coffees, and that's the first place I would start. It is complemented well by some very nice fruit brightness, as that's been one of the key points within this coffee that I've been discussing from the start. That's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Llano wash processed Guatemala from Llano Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.